James Sloan had imagined his future wife as soft-spoken and delicate, someone who would set flowers on the table and fill the empty ranch house with gentle words. But when the wagon dust cleared, he found himself staring up at a woman who looked like she could lift him off the ground with one arm. Grace Blaine stood tall in scuffed boots, shoulders broad, hands built for work rather than teacups. The letter in James's pocket suddenly felt like a cruel joke, and the wooden ring he had carved from oak seemed ridiculously small. 3 months earlier, he had placed an ad in the territorial paper with trembling hands. Honest rancher seeks kind companion. Must enjoy simple pleasures and quiet evenings. He had received only one reply, written in a careful script that spoke of loneliness that matched his own. Grace's letters painted pictures of shared meals and conversation, of someone who understood the weight of solitude on an empty homestead. Nowhere had she mentioned she could probably outwork half the men in town. Willard Knox, the merchant who had arranged their meeting, cleared his throat as he stepped down from the wagon seat. His eyes bounced between James's stunned face and Grace's imposing figure. She looked equally uncertain, her confident stance faltering as she took in his slight frame and the way he had to crane his neck to meet her gaze. For a long moment, no one moved. The neighbors who had gathered to watch whispered to each other. Mrs. Henderson muttered behind her hand. Little Tommy Morrison pointed until his mother yanked his arm down. James's cheeks burned hot. "You must be James," Grace said finally, her voice lower than he expected but not unkind. She extended a hand that swallowed his when he hesitated to take it. Her grip was firm yet careful, as though she already knew her own strength. "I suppose we should talk." The way she said it told James she was having the same doubts he was. Knox hurried to unload her single trunk, moving faster than necessary to escape the awkward silence. The trunk was larger than James expected, another reminder that nothing about this arrangement matched what he pictured. Yet Grace didn't wrinkle her nose at his humble ranch. She nodded approvingly at the vegetable garden and the neat firewood stack by the porch. Whatever she thought of him, she kept it to herself with a grace that surprised him. The next morning brought trouble. James's prize bull, Dakota, had smashed through the fence overnight and now stood in Mrs. Henderson's flower beds 3 properties over, destroying months of work. James gripped the porch rail, watching helplessly as neighbors shouted and waved ropes. Dakota weighed nearly a ton and was mean on a good day. 2 men already tried approaching him and barely escaped being trampled. James's stomach twisted. The gossip alone could ruin him. "You can't rope him from here," Grace said calmly beside him. He hadn't even heard her walk up. Her eyes stayed on the bull, steady and thoughtful. "And if they keep going at him from the front, somebody's going to get hurt." James groaned. Dakota's always been stubborn, but never like this. "I can't handle him when he's riled up." He hated saying it out loud, hated how true it was. His neighbors knew it too. Without another word, Grace stepped off the porch and strode toward the chaos. "Grace, wait," James called, hurrying after her, his shorter legs working double time. "He's dangerous when he's like this." But she didn't slow. By the time they reached Mrs. Henderson's property, the garden was wrecked. Roses crushed flat, stones scattered everywhere. Mrs. Henderson was shrieking at anyone who'd listen. "That monster destroyed everything, James Sloan. You're paying for every single plant." The neighbors murmured their agreement. Grace ignored them all. She studied Dakota like a puzzle. Then, before James could stop her, climbed the fence and walked straight toward the bull. The shouting died. Even Mrs. Henderson fell silent. The animal swung his massive head toward her, nostrils flaring. James froze, heart pounding so hard it hurt. She spoke to the bull in a soft, steady rhythm, not commanding but coaxing. Slowly, unbelievably, Dakota stopped pawing the ground. Inch by inch, Grace approached, hand out, voice low. When she touched his neck, the beast actually leaned into her hand like a dog looking for affection. "Someone bring a lead rope," she called without looking back. Knox rushed to fetch one. Within minutes, Grace was leading the massive bull away as calmly as if he'd never gone wild. Neighbors stared in open amazement. Mrs. Henderson's furious speech died in her throat. As they passed James, Grace gave him a small smile, warm enough to stop his breath. "Your fence has a weak post on the north side," she said. "We'd better fix it before he takes another stroll." By midday, everyone in the valley seemed to know what Grace Blaine had done. Word traveled fast out here, especially when it involved a woman walking up to a 2,000-pound bull like it was nothing more than an ornery dog. One by one, neighbors found reasons to ride over, offering to lend a hand with the fence or drop off a pie to welcome the new missus. James saw right through it. They wanted to see her up close, to measure this tall, capable stranger against the quiet man who'd sent off for a wife by mail. Grace didn't seem to mind the attention, at least not on the surface. She worked alongside James as if she'd been on the ranch her whole life, sleeves rolled to her elbows, swinging a sledgehammer like it weighed nothing. Each strike drove fence posts deep while James followed behind, stretching wire and tamping dirt, trying not to notice how many pairs of eyes were really watching her. Not him. Samuel Morrison showed up with his 3 sons in tow, leaning on the fence like he owned it. Herder ladies got away with livestock, he said with that slow drawl that made every word sound like a judgment. His oldest boy, big and broad-shouldered, grinned at Grace in a way that made James's jaw tighten. She grew up on a cattle ranch in Montana. James said evenly, though it still stung that he'd only learned this fact that morning. Her letters had talked about wanting peace and quiet, not the kind of life where a person learns to stare down angry bulls. The oldest Morrison boy sauntered closer, puffing out his chest. Maybe she'd like help with that post-hole digger. Looks like heavy work. He stopped short of saying for a woman, but the smirk finished the sentence for him. Grace paused mid-swing, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Her eyes flicked over the young man, polite but cool. "I've got a rhythm going," she said, voice pleasant but firm. "Why don't you help James stretch that wire instead?" The boy's smile faltered. His brothers shifted uneasily, not sure whether to laugh or bristle. Morrison himself just chewed the inside of his cheek and said nothing, but James could feel the judgment rolling off him like heat off sunbaked dirt. In Morrison's world, strength meant power, and power meant respect. By those rules, Grace fit and James didn't. James tried to push the thought aside, focusing on the work, but it clung to him like a burr. Every swing of Grace's hammer was a reminder of what he wasn't. He should have felt proud, grateful, even. Instead, he felt small. That evening, after the last curious neighbors finally drifted home, James and Grace sat on opposite ends of the porch. The air was heavy with crickets and unspoken questions. James fiddled with a splinter in the railing just to keep his hands busy. "This isn't what either of us expected, is it?" Grace's voice broke the silence, quieter now, a little tired. She wasn't looking at him, just staring at the horizon where the sky turned orange over the distant hills. James shifted in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "I should have been more clear in my letters," he said. "About what?" she asked, finally turning toward him. Her eyes were steady, searching, not unkind, but sharp enough to cut right through his hesitation. "About being shorter than most men," James said with a humorless laugh. "About living in a town where people measure a man by how much he can lift. About feeling like I'm not enough." He stared at his boots after saying it, the admission tasting bitter and raw. Grace drummed her fingers on the armrest, thoughtful. "You know what I saw today?" she asked. "When I walked out to Dakota?" James glanced at her warily. "What?" "I saw a man who cared more about my safety than his own pride," she said simply. "Most men would have yelled, 'Try to stop me,' even if it got them hurt. You didn't." James felt something loosen in his chest, though he wasn't sure if it was relief or just surprise. Grace leaned back, her gaze softening. "And what I should have written," she said, "is that I'm tired of being treated like a challenge. My whole life, people see me and think they've got something to prove." The words landed heavier than James expected. All day he'd been worrying about how he measured up. It hadn't crossed his mind that Grace had her own reasons for wanting a different life, her own weight to carry. "So what do we do now?" James asked finally, his voice quiet, not defensive anymore, just curious. Grace reached into her skirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, edges worn soft from being read too many times. "Do you remember what you wrote in your third letter?" she asked, unfolding it carefully in the fading light. "You said real partnership means 2 people making each other stronger, not one person making the other smaller." James remembered. At the time, it had felt like an impossible dream, something he'd written late at night to comfort himself more than anyone else. Hearing her read it back made it sound like a promise. I meant it, James said slowly, but I'm not sure I knew what it looked like. Grace folded the letter again, tucking it away. Maybe we'll figure out together, she said. James noticed the letters stuffed in Grace's pocket before she put them away, his letters creased and worn from being read and reread. The thought that she'd carried his words all this way made something warm push past the embarrassment he'd been choking on all day. You know what else I noticed this morning? Grace said, shifting to face him. When Dakota broke loose, you didn't run to get Morrison or the other men. You came to find me. James hadn't thought about it that way. He'd just gone to the person who seemed steady when everything went wrong. I guess I did, he said. In my last letter, Grace continued, I said I was tired of being alone. I didn't just mean alone on a ranch. I meant alone in my head, with my thoughts, my worries, my dreams. She met his eyes squarely. I think maybe we both were looking for someone to rescue us from that. James leaned forward, elbows on his knees. And what we actually need? Someone to share it with, Grace said softly. Not to fix everything, just to carry it together. The words stayed between them like the first cool breeze before a storm. James didn't know how to answer, but he didn't need to. For the first time since she stepped off the wagon, he felt like they were speaking the same language. Grace rose from her chair, brushing the dust from her skirt. But first, she said with a half smile, you're going to show me how you plan to propose. Because technically, we're still just strangers sitting on a porch. James blinked at her, then scrambled to his feet. His heart thudded so hard it made his hands shake as he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the small wooden box. Inside lay the ring he'd spent 3 months carving from a piece of fallen oak. It was simple, polished smooth by hours of work, and far from perfect. I planned to do this properly, James said, voice barely above a whisper. To wait until after we'd talked. Until I knew you weren't disappointed. He gestured awkwardly at himself, at the modest ranch, at everything she might have expected and hadn't found. Grace stepped closer, curiosity bright in her eyes. May I? She asked, holding out her hand. When he nodded, she lifted the ring, turning it in the moonlight. You made this yourself, she said softly, more statement than question. How long? 3 months, James admitted, his heart sinking as she slid it onto her finger and it stuck at her second knuckle. Too small, just like everything else about him seemed to feel. But Grace didn't frown. She smiled, genuine, warm, changing her whole face. 3 months, she repeated. You spent 3 months making something for a woman you hadn't met yet. That tells me more about you than you think. James shook his head, not trusting his voice. It tells me, Grace went on, that you're someone who takes care with important things. Someone who works at something even when nobody's watching. And someone smart enough to know rings can be resized, but character can't. The simple truth of it hit James like a rope snapping taut. All day, he'd been comparing muscles and height and strength. Grace was measuring something else entirely. So is that a yes? James asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Grace didn't answer with words. She took his trembling hands, closed them around the wooden ring, and said softly, ask me properly. Not because of an arrangement. Not because you feel you should. Because you want to. James looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd stepped down from Knox's wagon. Yes, she was taller, stronger, but there was also a quiet kindness in her eyes, a patience that hadn't come through in her letters. Something about her felt steady, like home. Grace Blaine, he said, voice steadying, will you marry me? Not because of letters, not because people expect it, but because I think we could build something good together. Something neither of us could build alone. Yes, she said simply, her smile soft but certain. But I have conditions. James's stomach clenched, but her tone stayed light. First, she said, slipping the too small ring off her finger, we resize this together. You teach me how to work wood, and I'll teach you about cattle, horses, and everything else I know. Relief washed through James so fast it left him dizzy. These weren't demands for him to change who he was. They were invitations to share lives, to trade strengths. I'd like that, he said. All of it. 6 months later, autumn settled over the valley, painting the hills gold and crimson. James Sloan stood beside Grace in the small white church at the edge of town. The wooden ring, now properly sized and joined by a matching band Grace had carved for him, gleamed softly on her finger. Their vows were simple, spoken without flourish, but every word felt alive. The ranch had changed since Grace's arrival. What once felt like too much land for one man's hands now thrived under two. James's careful eye for detail, paired with Grace's fearless strength, made them a team no one had expected. The corral stood firm with new posts sunk deep into the earth. The barn smelled of fresh-cut hay stacked high. Even Dakota, now properly contained, had sired calves sturdy enough to promise a future. But the work was more than just repairs and chores. James had taught Grace how to plane wood smooth, how to fit dovetails without gaps. She picked up the craft quickly, her strong hands surprisingly gentle when she worked with small tools. In turn, Grace taught James how to read a horse's ears, how to spot sickness in cattle before it turned dangerous, how to move among animals without spooking them. He didn't need to be strong to do those things. He needed to be patient, observant, things he'd always been good at but never counted as strengths. What surprised James most was how natural their days felt, as though the rhythm had always been there waiting for them. Mornings began with shared coffee on the porch, boots still dusty from yesterday. Afternoons ended with laughter as they argued over fence lines or how to stack firewood. And when neighbors passed by, they didn't whisper anymore. They waved. They lingered to talk. Even Samuel Morrison, who once looked at James like he didn't belong on his own ranch, stopped by one evening just to nod his approval without saying much at all. Yet it wasn't all ease. Some nights James still lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if Grace would eventually see what he saw in himself, someone not quite enough. And some mornings Grace lingered at the table, quiet, her eyes far away, as though she wondered if she'd traded one kind of loneliness for another. But when James caught her looking at him across the corral, or when she laughed at some clumsy joke of his, the doubts eased. On a cool evening, just before their wedding, they sat side by side on the porch, Dakota's heavy breaths audible from a barn. Grace broke the silence first. "Do you ever wonder if people will stop measuring us?" James tilted his head. "Measuring us how?" "You know." She gestured at herself, then at him. "Strong, weak, big, small. Who's supposed to do what?" James considered. "Maybe, but I think folks are already starting to see it different. They're seeing what we can do together." Grace smiled at that, a tired but honest smile. "You really believe that?" "I do," James said. "Besides, I'm not building this life for them. I'm building it with you." For a moment, Grace just looked at him, as though weighing something unspoken. Then she reached out, her hand warm over his, and whispered, "Good. Because I'm not planning to go anywhere." The wedding day itself was small, but full of quiet pride. Neighbors filled the little church, the same neighbors who once questioned why Grace would come to a man like James. As the preacher spoke, James spotted Samuel Morrison in the back row. The man who had once measured him with nothing but contempt now gave a single, solid nod. When it was over, when the rice had been thrown and the handshakes offered, James and Grace returned to the ranch as husband and wife. The house didn't feel so empty anymore. The rooms seemed brighter, not because anything had changed inside them, but because they were no longer waiting for something to fill them. As evening fell, James lit the lamp on the porch. Grace stepped outside, still in her simple dress, barefoot now, hair loose from its pins. The sight of her like that, strong and unguarded, made James's throat tighten. "You know," she said, holding out her hand to show the ring, "this isn't perfect." James blinked. "The fit's right now." "Not the fit," Grace said with a laugh. "The carving. It's not even all the way around. You left the spot a little rough." James felt heat creep up his neck. "I didn't have time to." "I like it," she interrupted gently. "Means it's real. Means it's yours." James stared at her, unsure what to say. Grace took a step closer, eyes soft in the lamplight. "That's what marriage is, James. Not perfect, just real, just ours." And for the first time, James believed it. The first winter they spent together came early and hard. Snow piled up against the fences, and the wind howled down from the mountains for days at a time. James was used to working alone in weather like this, his breath freezing in his beard as he trudged through drifts, checking on animals and breaking ice from the water troughs. But now there was Grace beside him, tall and steady, moving as if the cold didn't bite her the way it bit him. When the woodpile ran low after a week of storms, James went out with his axe, determined to keep up. Grace followed him without a word, lifting her own axe and splitting logs with smooth, powerful strokes. James tried to match her, but after an hour his shoulders burned and his hands ached from the cold. He hated the thought of quitting first. "James," Grace said finally, her breath white in the air, "take a break." "I'm fine," he muttered, setting another log on the stump. But when he swung, the blade glanced off the side, sending the log spinning. His arms trembled from the effort. Grace stepped closer, taking the axe from him gently. "This isn't a contest," she said. "We're just trying to stay warm." James wanted to argue, but instead he just nodded, his pride sinking lower than the snowdrifts. He sat on the edge of the porch, rubbing his sore hands, watching her finish the work with easy rhythm. It was hard not to feel small. That night, by the fire, Grace pressed a cup of coffee into his hands. "You're quiet," she said. "Just tired," James replied, staring at the flames. "Not just tired," she said. "You're angry at yourself." He didn't answer right away. The truth sat heavy in his chest. "I should be able to do more," he said finally. "Men around here, they don't have their wives doing the heavy work." Grace studied him across the firelight, her eyes calm but serious. "Do you think less of me because I can't sew as fine as Mrs. Henderson? Because I burn biscuits half the time?" James blinked. "Of course not." "Then why do you think less of yourself because I can swing an axe?" she asked gently. James didn't know what to say to that. The next morning, Grace woke him early. "Come on," she said, handing him his coat. "I've got something to show you." They walked to the barn, where Dakota's calves huddled close for warmth. Grace showed him how to check their ears for frostbite, how to keep water open without exhausting himself, how to move carefully around big animals so he didn't need brute strength to keep control. "You don't have to fight everything," she told him. "You just have to outthink it." By the end of the week, James was doing chores in ways he'd never thought of, using pulleys to lift feed, carrying smaller loads more often, working with rhythm instead of sheer muscle. Grace didn't say much about it, but James caught her smiling sometimes when she saw him figuring things out. In February, the storm finally broke. The valley lay under a blanket of white, the air so still it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. James and Grace stood outside together, shovels in hand, clearing the path to the barn. When the last pile of snow was moved, James leaned on his shovel, chest heaving, and looked at her. "I don't know what I'd have done this winter without you," he said. Grace brushed snow from her coat. "You'd have managed," she said simply. "But it's easier with two." Her words stuck with him all day. Later that night, as they sat at the kitchen table eating stew by lamplight, James reached across and took her hand. She looked surprised. "What's that for?" she asked. "Just thank you," James said, "for not making me feel weak, even when I am." Grace squeezed his hand. "You're not weak, James," she said. "You're learning. There's a difference." For the first time in a long while, James believed her. By spring, the ranch felt alive again. Snow melted into rushing streams, grass pushed through the muddy ground, and the animals filled out after the long winter. James noticed something else too. People in town treated him differently. It wasn't that they stopped noticing Grace's size or strength, but they seemed to look at the two of them as a team now. Neighbors dropped by not to judge, but to ask advice. Mrs. Henderson, whose roses had barely started growing back, sent over a basket of bread and didn't mention the bull. Even Samuel Morrison tipped his hat one afternoon when he rode past. James still didn't know if it was respect or just curiosity, but it felt better than the quiet laughter he used to hear behind his back. Life with Grace settled into a rhythm. In the mornings, they worked side by side, mending fences, cleaning the barn, planting early crops. In the evenings, Grace sat at the table sanding wood, learning to shape small things under James's patient instruction. She was clumsy at first, too heavy-handed, but she didn't quit. James found himself smiling every time she finished a smooth piece, proud of her stubborn focus. One afternoon, as they loaded feed into the wagon, Morrison's eldest son rode up again, grinning like he owned the whole valley. "Howdy, Mrs. Sloan," he said, giving Grace an exaggerated bow. Need a hand with that? James bristled, but Grace just smiled politely. We've got it, she said. The boy lingered anyway, his eyes on Grace more than the feed. Strong woman like you could probably run this place alone, he said with a laugh that wasn't entirely friendly. James's face burned. He opened his mouth to snap back, but Grace spoke first, her voice calm. Maybe, she said, but I don't want to. I'd rather run it with someone who sees things I don't. The boy blinked, thrown off, then muttered something about needing to get home and rode off. James stayed quiet as they finished loading the wagon, but his jaw was tight. You okay? Grace asked, glancing at him. I hate when people talk like that, James said. Like I'm not enough for you. Grace leaned on the wagon, watching him with that level gaze of hers. Do you think I care what they say? No, James admitted. But I do. Grace stepped closer, lowering her voice. Then stop. Let them measure whatever they want. I didn't come here for them. I came here for you. The simple words hit James harder than he expected. For a moment, he just stood there, swallowing down the tightness in his throat. Later that evening, while repairing the north fence line, James caught Grace watching him as he tightened the wire with steady, practiced hands. Not with pity, but with pride. It made his chest feel lighter than it had in months. When they sat on the porch that night, Grace pulled something from her pocket, a small carving knife James had given her weeks before. She turned it over in her fingers, thoughtful. You know, she said, when I first read your letters, I thought you were just kind. I didn't realize you were also stubborn. James chuckled softly. Is that a compliment? It is, Grace said, smiling faintly. Takes stubbornness to build something real. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the stars stretching wide over the valley. Then Grace said quietly, Do you ever wonder if we're doing this right? James glanced at her. This? You mean the ranch? I mean us, Grace said. We didn't start the way most folks do. James thought about it. Maybe that's why it works, he said. We had to learn each other before we could pretend to know everything. Grace reached over, lacing her fingers with his. Good answer, she murmured. As summer warmed the land, their work grew harder but somehow easier to share. James found himself less worried about how others saw him, more focused on the life they were building together. Grace didn't slow down, and James didn't need to keep up. They moved in rhythm now, different strengths fitting together like pieces cut from the same board. By late summer, the ranch no longer looked like the same place James had lived in alone. The barn door no longer sagged, the fences stood straight, and the corral stayed tight no matter how hard Dakota pushed. But the real change was quieter, harder to point to, the way the house felt lived in. Grace's boots sat by the door next to his. 2 coffee cups waited on the table every morning instead of one. One afternoon, they were repairing a section of irrigation ditch when Grace stopped to wipe her forehead and looked at him carefully. You've been quiet all day, she said. Just thinking, James replied, pushing dirt with his shovel. About what? He hesitated, leaning on the handle. About how folks see us. Sometimes I think they're just waiting to see which one of us gives out first. Grace studied him for a long moment. And which one do you think they're betting on? Me, James said simply. And I hate that it bothers me. Grace set down her shovel and walked closer. James, you got to stop living in other people's heads. It's crowded in there. He gave a weak laugh, but didn't meet her eyes. I just don't want you to feel like you got the short end of the deal. Grace tilted her head, really looking at him. Do you? Sometimes, he admitted. I write you letters about building a quiet life. About being a man you can depend on. Then you show up and tame a bull I couldn't even rope. Makes me wonder if you expected someone stronger. Grace stepped close enough that her shadow fell over him. James Sloan, she said softly, I didn't come here looking for someone to prove himself. I came here looking for someone who'd stand beside me, not in front of me or behind me. He looked up at her, caught off guard by the weight of her voice. You think strength is all about swinging an axe, Grace continued. But I've known plenty of strong men who couldn't stay long enough to finish what they started. You stay. Something in James's chest loosened at those words, though it made his throat tight at the same time. That evening, after the ditch was finished and the tools put away, they sat on the porch as the sky turned deep purple over the hills. Grace brought out the little carving knife again, shaping a piece of oak into a smooth handle for the water pump. James watched her work, the lamplight catching the wood shavings as they curled away. "You're getting good at that," he said. "Good teacher," she replied without looking up. Then, after a pause, "You know what I like about carving?" "What?" "You can't rush it," Grace said. "If you try to force it, you ruin the piece. You got to go slow, pay attention to where the grain wants to go." James nodded, understanding more than she knew. "Sounds a lot like marriage," he said quietly. Grace smiled at that, setting the knife down. "Exactly." They didn't talk much more that night, but the silence wasn't heavy. It felt warm, like they didn't need to fill it with words. In early September, the first calf born under their care took its first shaky steps in the corral. James watched Grace kneel in the dirt beside the little animal, checking its legs with careful hands. When she looked up at him and grinned, James felt something steady settle inside him. Later that evening, as they finished dinner, Grace reached across the table and said, "You realize this is the first season we haven't lost a single head of cattle?" James looked at her, surprised. "I hadn't thought about it." "Well, I have," Grace said. "That's your doing. You're the one who checks every fence post, who notices when a latch is loose, who plans ahead so nothing slips through." James felt his face warm. "I just do what needs doing." Grace squeezed his hand. "That's called being steady. That's rarer than you think." The word stayed with him long after they'd gone to bed. For the first time, James wondered if strength came in more shapes than anyone in town cared to admit. By October, the valley was gold and red, the air cool in the mornings and soft in the evenings. James and Grace stood in the small church again, this time as husband and wife, sharing their vows in front of friends who no longer whispered behind their backs. The wooden ring James carved, now perfectly fitted and joined by the band Grace had made for him, glowed in the light as they clasped hands. The months after their wedding were steady and full. They worked side by side through the long autumn days, mending fences, bringing in the last of the hay, caring for the herd. The ranch began to prosper in ways James hadn't thought possible. It wasn't because either of them worked harder than anyone else. It was because they worked together. His careful eye for detail kept everything running smoothly, and her fearless strength made the hardest jobs lighter. Neighbors stopped coming around to gawk and started coming for advice. Even Samuel Morrison, who once sneered at James, now asked his opinion about breeding stock. When Grace passed by, folks nodded with real respect instead of whispered curiosity. And when they looked at James, they didn't see the quiet man who once wrote letters out of loneliness. They saw someone building a life worth envying. But what mattered most wasn't how the neighbors saw them. It was how James started to see himself. One evening, as they sat on the porch with coffee in hand, Grace turned to him and said, "You know what I've learned since coming here?" "What's that?" James asked. "That strength isn't about who swings the biggest axe," she said. "It's about who shows up every single day, even when it's hard, even when no one's watching." James smiled at that, the truth of it settling deep in his chest. "Funny," he said. "I was just thinking the same thing about you." Grace laughed softly, leaning back in her chair. "So I guess we're both strong in our own ways." The sun dipped low over the hills, casting the ranch in a warm glow. Dakota snorted from the corral, and the calves pressed close to their mothers. James looked around at the land, at the fences standing firm and the barn roof shining in the fading light, and felt a quiet pride he hadn't known before. "Do you regret it?" he asked suddenly. "Coming here? Choosing me?" Grace turned her head, her expression soft but certain. "Not for a second. You're the only man I know who'd carve a ring for a stranger just because he believed in something good." James chuckled, a little embarrassed. "It wasn't perfect." Grace reached over, took his hand, and said, "Neither are we. That's why it works." As the last light faded and the first stars appeared, James finally understood what their letters had been circling all along. Life wasn't about being the strongest or the biggest. It wasn't about proving yourself to people who never mattered. It was about building something true with someone who believed in you, even on the days you couldn't believe in yourself. The moral was simple, but it felt hard-earned. Real strength isn't about size or power. It's about steady love, quiet effort, and showing up for each other every single day. James squeezed Grace's hand and whispered, "I'm glad it's you." Grace smiled, her eyes warm in the starlight. "Me too," she said. And for once, James didn't feel small at all.